and here we are, um, in our rooms with no birds except for my loon in the back there. And I figured out something last summer that loons learn to fly by diving. First, you have to build up your muscles by flying underwater, and
Mm.
then you can fly above. And those loonlings that don't make it by the end of the season, and first the father gives up, and then the mother hangs around for up to 2 months, and then if she finally gives up because the weather's getting really bad, and it'll always be the one who never dove very much, or hunted leeches in a foot and a half of or 2 feet of water and didn't go into the deep lake and just wasn't strong enough to make it happen. Quite
Mm.
something. So first you got to fly underwater, then you can fly in the air. That's
Mm.
that's the teaching of the loon, I think. Yeah.
I saw an eagle swimming today.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, they do swim, apparently. Yeah, pulling its wings through the water, very grave, uh, solemn. It was either, my guess is, I guess they could be hauling prey,
Mm-hmm.
too big to fly, or else they got in a tussle or got thrown in the water and got waterlogged. Um, so that's my guess because it looked a little bit embarrassed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
The
that's better than it being injured. That's my hope is that it's not injured. But
Yeah, the poet Dennis Reed, who lives in Victoria, and he spends more time fishing than he
Fishing.
does writing poetry, and he's kind of, major fishing guy in Vancouver Island. But he says, you go out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and eagles will be riding a thermal high, high, high up as far as you can see, and then they will cross to Port Angeles across the strait. Sometimes he says
oh,
they don't make it, and they
they don't
got
make
to
it.
do that swimming thing.
Yeah.
Wow, pretty serious.
Yeah. Well, it made
Power,
it to shore.
powerful
But
bird to even think of doing that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But here we are in the Walla Walla Valley today. We're looking maybe not at birds, but at the kind of agreements people make about land and the ways they may misunderstand each other and the frustrations all around. And we're going to try to apply some of our wah wah understanding to the situation. And um, yeah, that's that's the hope for today. Any comments about last week, about what work you've been doing? Anything? Anyone wish to report in?
I should let you know I didn't get back to you after the comments that you gave me on the poem that I sent you because I went down a rabbit hole with both Halkamium and Chinagwawa.
Yeah.
I think the poem is now finished, but it took a while to find the right words. So, yeah. So, and I discovered that Google is not a bad resource for finding places where you can learn the correct pronunciation. There's lots and lots of information out there, and there are people apparently, especially in Oregon and Washington, that are trying to resurrect the language. So,
Ah,
or at
Oh,
least keep
really?
it from
Hmm.
completely disappearing. So, yeah, there's just a great big giant rabbit hole out there that you can fall into. So,
well, I'm glad you made it back out.
yeah.
Anyone else? Rob?
I just I just really enjoyed the Gaelica. Uh there were a few blessings and such in there that just blew my socks away. One of the things that really struck me was, well, you showed it on the screen. He's mentioned the eyes of crocodiles and the teeth of sharks, I think. And I was thinking, how would a person in Scotland know about the eyes of crocodiles?
they were they probably very well read, I guess.
Yeah, maybe. But
Um,
anyways,
but
yeah, I just really
when
have
you
been enjoying
consider
this,
that, sorry, go on.
and the presentation you gave yesterday, I actually watched a little bit today just while I was cooking lunch because it was so evocative. It just there's something about hearing you play with language that way and tying it back over and over again into these ancient sounds that's just sound more earthy and guttural to me than the words have come to mean because they've become all meaning at this point. When you use them a lot, you just know the meaning. You don't think a lot about the sound. So that's how I just really find it generative to ponder all this.
Good. That sounds
Yeah.
fun. That's
hmm
I want to have
And the
fun.
triplicate thing, I've been practicing with that. That's been fun too. The
Great.
threes, doing things in threes.
Jim?
Well, I sent a message to Ian Gibbon, who's one of the main people involved in video poetry. He's a really good video poet.
Uh-huh.
Because you were interested in getting to know a little bit about video poetry. I haven't got an answer yet, but when I do, basically I was asking him for what sites and would you recommend that I show Harold for an introduction to video poetry. So I will have that for you, in the next little while.
Great. I look forward to it. Yeah. Lauren?
Yeah, I just was sort of feeling into the rhythm of threes, um, and into the Gaelic language. Many, many years ago when I lived in Toronto, I joined a choir that was a Gaelic choir. And it
Oh,
was,
fun. Yeah.
Wow.
well, fun for everyone else, but I was basically mute the whole time because there's no way that I could actually read it. The sounds and letters and language is it's so different. Um, so yeah, that was what sort of twigged my memory about Gaelic. I love the sound of it.
Mm.
I love the sound, but yes, the choir was not meant to be.
Oh dear.
So yeah, so just yeah, feel just kind of feeling into the rhythm of threes and sort of poked around with trying to write a few um pr sort of prayers and blessings using that principle, and yeah, that's what I was up to.
Cool. I have a friend who's been writing for 60 years and has he's on an autism spectrum and he's quite out there, but he's a high functioning and yet his writing is difficult to understand for many. For some reason, I can read it perfectly well, but that might say more about me than anything else. However, he is now, because he's aging and he wants his work to actually have an audience that can read it, he is training a small language model, artificial intelligence, on his work so that it can take all the stuff he's written and put it into linear narratives that could be read as novels that take his experience working in aid development and other things like that in the third world and apply that experience in some pretty scary places into narratives that people can read and will be helpful for people. However, the product, although it usually has a really nice plot, is missing a certain human dimension. And the reason I bring that up is it I talked to him about this earlier today, and I said, you got to train this machine on a little bit of rhetoric. Otherwise, it's not going to sound like a human is speaking. And he said, "Oh yeah, but that's just a little bit too hard right now." And he wants to go in the other direction, and that's kind of the point. Paul is talking about cognitive resilience, and we've been talking about how interesting these patterns of three are, and that is something that is very human. This kind of patterned rhetoric, and the machines can't do that. And so yeah, I think it's wonderful that there's been a positive response to that, because a lot can come of it, and it's ours, and that's great. That's my take.
It is interesting that that rhythm of three. It really does feel like it's kind of in our bodies in a way. Like it's um, from I mean, obviously we're reacquainted with it in the workshop here, but I think it's something that's just familiar in a kind of embodied way, and I can't even say exactly where from, just that it does something. It's so hard to talk about body sensation. It does something pleasant in the body in the body. You know, um, yeah, there's something about that rhythm that feels very pleasing inside. That's the best I can express it.
Mm-hmm. Um, however, if we were to be perfectly fair in a larger cultural context, let's say 20 years ago, even less, postmodern poetic theorists and critics and practitioners would say that because English language falls into threes, we must resist the threes at all times. Never give in to the threes, because language taking over from us. So there's an assumption there that the language is at war with us or something. And maybe it is. Some people have suggested that it's kind of got its own life and its own narrative. And but if that's the case, we're in a relationship. It doesn't mean you have to deny the other person in the relationship in order for the relationship to continue in a meaningful way. But I thought I would, throw that in just so that the
Yeah.
postmodernists had their say in this conversation, because they're a smart bunch, but they have their own take on things. Yeah.
I
So,
have a really quick question in regard to English and its structure and all of that. I'm just wondering if you have any information about how we got to where we are with English being a nonverbal language. And I don't mean that it's not, we speak it, but it's not verb based the way many other languages are. And diving into Chinekwawa, I'm also learning Hebrew and Yiddish, and there isn't the same kind of reliance on on the verb to be, the way there is in English, for grammatical purposes. In fact, in Hebrew, it doesn't even exist. So I'm just wondering, was there ever a time in English where it didn't exist?
what didn't exist?
The verb to be.
Oh, I I don't know. I would guess that it's been there for a long time. However, what form it took and how it was used, that's another matter. Yeah, it might not have been to be as a concept, but the concept of being was probably there. And my hunch would be that the word life would have been more dominant. Um, because we can talk about a living rock and the living sea and living water and all these things which aren't biological entities, which is the modern definition of the words life, living, and so on. Obviously, in the past, living and life were a different quality, and that seems to be pretty close to being just a hunch that they were that being might be a modern variant of living, and living got hived off to a special use. Just a hunch.
Can I ask
Is
a
it just,
question?
sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead, Jim.
What do you mean by the verb to be? I don't understand what that means.
So when you say something is, in other languages, you never say that. You simply state what it, the thing, and then you state the action of the thing, or you state the description of the thing. You may modify the thing, but you never say it is something. It just the verb to be just in many languages it just doesn't exist, and it seems to be somewhat like what you were talking about in session 2, Harold, about the using the verb as a descriptive rather than saying that something is like, and using the metaphors and the similes and all that we've all been taught to do, um, and getting your head out of that. And it just clicked while I was practicing doing that there are other languages that just do that. That's just the way the language is constructed. And I was just started to get really curious about how did English get to the place where it's become so abstracted.
Yeah. Um, I would say the Enlightenment has a lot to do with it, and I would say the philosophy of Wittgenstein has a lot to do with it, and that's a century ago that he was working. And his idea of the natural philosophy, it was created in English, not in some other language. But who knows? I think other people have suggested English is the way it is because it's kind of a pidgin language that was created by people dealing with a huge number of invasions and continually adapting, and a language that was always in change, and bringing in new things, and a simple structure of noun plus verb plus object. It's pretty easy to learn and apply. But if we broaden out a little bit and we look at German, where verbs of being are ancient, and English is a Germanic language as well. So the philosopher Heidegger built his whole career in the early 20th century on notions of being, and what that might mean. So these are old things, but it is an interesting thing. Why is English like that and others aren't? When I studied classical Greek when I was young, one of the beautiful things about it is you can have words in almost any order because they're all so inflected. They have word parts on the beginning and word parts on the end in different cases and moods, and so the relationships between words are all there. You can, for emphasis, change the order, but you might have a long sentence that goes for half a page, really long, and the verb that makes sense of all of it is the last word. And you get strung along. You go, oh, yes, not nice, nice. Whoa. That's what it all means. And then it sorts itself in your mind backwards until it all gels. It was
Right.
really cool, but English doesn't really do that. You can force it to. You know, yeah. Interesting
So,
question.
Carla, are you kind of suggesting that that verb is kind of unfortunate, like something to avoid, that it somehow
No,
is?
no, I
No.
was just I
Okay.
was just curious as to, because it's so ingrained in the
Yeah.
way we write and in the way that you're taught grammar in English, that that it's almost like you have to untrain yourself if you don't want to do it.
Right.
That because it's like it's I think there are a lot of people that say that language sets the way that you look at the world, and I'm trying to broaden my perspective in that not everybody looks at the world in the same way, and that I think
Yeah.
language is greatly attached to that.
Hmm. It's interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, hi, Julie.
Hi.
Hi.
It's good to see
Well,
you.
We're just quickly catching up, and then we're going to move forward into our workshop for today. Do you have any comments on what you've been doing?
I've just been looking through this treaty thing that you sent out,
Okay.
and looking through that, but not
Have you
really.
ever ever seen that treaty before?
Well, it was Treaty Day maybe 10 days ago here. Is that right? Somebody from Washington know this? Um, which marks the day that the treaty, the Point Elliott Treaty was signed around here with the
Oh,
Samish
okay.
and Swinomish and Duala and all those Tulalip, the Tulalip tribes.
Yeah.
Um, so I have not seen this treaty. I've seen the Point Elliott, which was
Okay.
also Governor Stevens.
Yes. He
Mhm.
wanted his railroad, and he needed to get his treaties lined up in a hurry for his own political reasons, and that's how the world works. But yeah. Um, yeah, so okay, so we're going to look at this treaty today, and there's something missing from this very important treaty, and that's the story of Frenchtown, of the French Canadian and Indigenous town in the Walla Walla Valley, now in Washington, stretching down towards Templeton in Oregon, and everything about this treaty takes place in this Canadian town where people spoke French, and it is never mentioned. So I thought, why don't we start with about a 3.5 minute introduction to Frenchtown today, just for fun, and then we can look at the treaty. Does that sound like a plan?
Sure.
Okay, off to Frenchtown we go. And oh, I have to share sound and video, and we're going to share it. Going to go to full screen, and we're going to play.
The Frenchtown Historic Site marks a mixed marriage community of French-Canadian trappers, traders, and Indigenous women who lived here beginning in the 1820s. Frenchtown had a distinct Métis, or mixed cultural identity, very different from that of the predominantly English-speaking Protestant settlers to come. Originally known as the Village des Canadiens, Frenchtown remained Catholic and French-speaking well into the 20th century, in part reinforced by later arrivals from Quebec. At its height, the Frenchtown community consisted of about 50 cabins scattered along the Walla Walla River and its tributaries, interspersed among cayuse camps and farms. By the time American missionaries Marcus and Narcissa Whitman arrived in 1836, at least a dozen Métis families were already living within a few miles of the site of the mission. The present-day Frenchtown site preserves a historic cabin and cemetery from this community. The Prince's Cabin is thought to be the oldest standing cabin in the state of Washington. The cabin originally stood at a cayuse wintering place 2 miles to the east and was donated to the Frenchtown Historical Foundation in 2012. It was built by Hudson's Bay Company trader Pierre Chrysologue Pambron for a cayuse man referred to as the Prince. His cayuse name was not recorded. Volunteers spent nearly 4,000 hours moving and restoring the cabin to its present state. The Prince's Cabin stands today as an outstanding example of early 19th century French-Canadian cabin architecture in the Northwest. St. Louis Catholic Cemetery marks the final resting place for at least 80 Frenchtown people, including almost 30 children. While no grave markers remain, the names of the dead, recovered from Catholic Church records, are visible at the site today. Imagery suggests that Frenchtown settlers divided the land according to le rond, or the long lot system, in which each farmer claimed a long, thin strip of land along the river. This practice maximized the number of farms with access to the waterway, which doubled as the principal road. Although the 1862 Homestead Act carved the land into square blocks, a small portion of the Frenchtown area still shows traces of the long lot system in practice. Ultimately, Frenchtown is more than just a physical site. Volunteers with the Frenchtown Historical Foundation maintain the site, work to restore native plants, provide programming for Northwest history and local schools, and share family history and research. Learn more about the history of Frenchtown. Come and visit us today.
So that's Frenchtown. That is also right at the center of the Cayuse War of 1848 and very close to where the Walla Walla Treaty Council took place in 1855. And one of the interesting things, if we're speaking about language and identity, is the French Canadian men all married, I think all, but or mostly married to Indigenous women, scattered when violence broke out and went to live with their wives' families in other places, and were many of them dispossessed of their land holdings on the argument that in a war no one could be neutral. You had to take a side. So if you didn't fight the Cayuse on the side of the Oregon Volunteers, then you were on the side of the Cayuse, and the war was used to dispossess the Cayuse of their homeland, a process which culminated 7 years later in the treaty we're going to look at today. So that was Frenchtown. I also have a little slideshow to introduce you to all that history so that we have some shared background, because I'm guessing that the Cayuse War might not be something that all of us has looked at very much. Am I guessing correctly? Who knows a lot about the Cayuse War? Anyone? No. Okay. Well,
Nope.
you'll be up to speed before you know it. So let's give this a try. Here we go.
And what part of Oregon is this?
This is in the southeastern of
Southeastern.
Washington,
Okay.
north of Pendleton, Oregon, and east of Tri-Cities, Washington.
Just right on the border between Washington and Oregon.
Yes,
Yeah.
in the east. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay, so let's see if I can make this a little. What have I done? No, I don't want that anymore. Okay, here, let's make this a little bigger. And we can, there we go, make it big enough. And we'll see what happens. Okay, so the 1855 Walla Walla Treaty Council. Here's a little bit of historic treaty making. 1805, Lewis and Clark come from the United States through the newly purchased territory of Louisiana. They come through Nez Perce territory. They arrive here on the Columbia River at the future site of Fort Nez Perce at Wallula, south of Tri-Cities. And the chief Yellowpit has come across the river to greet them with a horse in the hope of a future relationship. If we go forward a bit in time, the Hudson's Bay Company is operating in the region, and they decided they would engage in a kind of treaty making by encouraging chiefs to send their sons to the Red River School, kind of downtown for Cascadia at that time, and what is now centered in what is now Winnipeg, Manitoba, on the plains. And the first one was a boy called Spokane Gary. The way they named these young men was to name them after their father's tribe. He would be the chief, and then to give a last name after a prominent Hudson's Bay Company leader. So Spokane Gary went to the Red River School. Many books have been written about Spokane Gary. The idea was if the sons of the chiefs would go and learn good Anglican Christian practice, they would come back as the future chiefs and teach their tribes how to be good, responsible Christians, and friction between newcomers and the people of the land would be erased. So there were quite a few of them. Spokane Gary, Kootenai Pelly, Kootenai Collins, Spokane Barons, Cayuse Halket, Nez Perce Pitt, and Nez Perce Ellis, and one that's very central to our story, To'ayanu, the son of Cayuse chief Pio Pio Mox Mox, who was sent not to the Red River School, but to the Willamette Mission in the Willamette Valley, which was a Methodist boarding school. And he was given the name of Elijah Heading after the bishop of the Methodist Church, Elijah Heading, from 1824 to 1852. That's Elijah Heading. On the right, I could not find an image of Pio Pio Mox Mox's son, who was murdered at Sutter's Fort in California a couple years before this treaty council, and his death was a great betrayal that in no small way contributed to the need for a treaty. But other treaty making would be the kind of bargaining that went on at Fort Nez Perce, where commercial relationships set a kind of peace. And of course, Frenchtown, as I've showed you, where the Canadian men were marrying a local indigenous women and settling down among their wives' families for a kind of treaty making and access to land based upon integration into families. And you've seen the image of Frenchtown's 50 settlements in the little video we looked at. And it was into this village that the American missionaries, the Whitmans, came and set up their Waialatpu mission, which was around 1835, I believe. And it was in the middle of the French Canadian village, in the middle of the Cayuse village, which is rarely historically mentioned. It's now, as you can see, this is the Oregon Trail. One branch of it came right through the mission grounds, and a lot of people who came and were in distress from the journey, women who had lost their husbands or their children were sick, or people who were just devastated by the brutality and violence of this trip, were nursed back to health or looked after by Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, who ran the camp. Unfortunately, They were brought in by Pio Pio Mox Mox, the chief, in order to gain their Christian power so that the tribe would have access to the spiritual power that allowed the whites to be so powerful and successful. And they were unable to make more than one real convert to the church. And it wasn't terribly successful. There was animosity. Marcus became more and more convinced that the future for the country would be for it to become U.S. American, and he actually led the first of the caravans on the Oregon Trail, and started that process of settlement. At the same time, measles came in 1847, either because Pio Pio Mox Mox and some of his leading men went down to Sutter's Fort in California to try to get some kind of compensation for the death of his son, and brought measles back from there, or because the 1847 caravan brought measles. Either way, the Cayuse almost went extinct that year because the measles epidemic was catastrophic. And because Marcus was a doctor and considered their medicine man, according to Cayuse law, a failed medicine man forfeits his life. There was an attack at the mission. Marcus was killed, and Narcissa shortly thereafter, and I think a dozen other people. There were 30 hostages taken, women and children, a couple men, and 50 years later, a few of the women came together who were hostages and were rescued and posed for this photograph. The women were rescued through the efforts of the Hudson's Bay Company trader from Fort Vancouver, Peter Skeen Ogden, who used his goodwill with the tribe to broker a deal for their release, and he brought a load of goods from the fort as payment. This is kind of an indigenous form of compensation for the death of family members, and some people have suggested that what he effectively did is buy the slaves who were the hostages. At any rate, they were freed, and thanks to Ogden's efforts, and eventually a monument to them was erected at the mission site. And a century after the founding of the mission, here from 1936, this was remained a much loved story of the settling of the American West, and the tragedy that befell the Whitmans. And it's only recently that the story of the application of Cayuse law has come to the surface, and before that it was considered a brutal attack. One of the things that the Cayuse were going to California for was to get cattle. These are some Cayuse cattle today, the kind of cattle that they would have gone to California to get. By the time these wars took place, they had hundreds of cattle, originally sourced from California. The Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Vancouver sourced their cattle from there as well, as did the French-Canadian settlers in the Willamette Valley. It wasn't really a wild west by the time these wars took place. There was a lot of modernization that had already taken place. This is Sutter's Fort in California. It's famous for being the place where the California gold rush of 1849 began. This is Johann Sutter. He comes from Kandern in the Black Forest of southern Germany. He operated as a Prussian military officer in Neuchâtel, which is in Western Switzerland. It was Prussian at the time. He's called Swiss, but he wasn't really Swiss. But he did call his fort New Switzerland. And if you take a look at this is kind of an exaggerated view because it's really on the flat, but it's an exaggerated view because look at this. Look at the towers on the side of the entrance, and then look at this picture of the town gate in Neuchâtel, Switzerland. Somebody, whoever drew that picture, knew what they were representing. Here's the fort today in Sacramento, restored and much visited for historical purposes. By the time we get to 1855, pressure has been brewing in Cascadia. Here we are in Oregon in 1855. War over access to gold mines in the Rogue River, right in the south of the state, has led to a lot of conflict, and there was a call for volunteers to form a militia to clear the native people out of the valley so that mining could continue. This is a photograph of the volunteers. This is largely what the war would look like when it came to the Yakima Valley in 1855 as well, and organized in the same way. In 1847, after the death of the Whitmans, there was a call for revenge against the Cayuse, and this is the proclamation from George Abernethy, governor of Oregon Territory, calling for volunteers to form a militia. 100 men he was calling for, and here's an image of some Oregon volunteer militia. I don't have a date for this one. And here are some Cayuse War era veterans from Oregon. The photograph was taken in 1870 or 1879. One of the interesting things about the photo is if you look at these guys, I mean, this wasn't a regular military operation because 30 years after that attack and retribution for the death of the Whitmans, they're quite elderly men. They're not like they weren't 20-year-old military recruits. They're not 50 years old now. They're a lot older than that. So kind of shows who took part maybe in these operations. The first conflict was at the mission, the Wascopam mission at the Dalles, and it was a cattle raid by the Cayuse. And this was something that had was part of indigenous culture and had been going on along this the western terminus of the Oregon Trail for quite some time, for many years, and it was used as an excuse for declaring the conflict a war and increasing the violence. Here's a posed picture of some Cayuse men on the banks of the Columbia. It's called Cayuse on the Warpath, but it's just a posed photo. But perhaps it's a little indication of who was facing off against these men. The final battle of the conflict took place here in the Touchet River Coulee, and earlier battles took place in Frenchtown, along the Walla River, between the river and the hills here, to the north of the river in this narrow band, usually with the Cayuse on the hilltops and the Americans using the French-Canadian cabins as forts and firing points. Here's Pio Pio Mox Mox. In the yeah, he argued for peace in both of the conflicts, the one in 1847 and the one in 1855. However, let's go back to 1847. There was two things happened. One, all land was taken away from the Cayuse on the terms that land won in war doesn't get returned to the aggressors in the war, and the Cayuse were termed aggressors because of the cattle thieving around the Dalles and a few other things like that. So 5 men from the Cayuse tribe were given up as the leaders of the attacks on the Americans when they arrived in the Walla Walla Valley, and they were hung in Oregon City, I believe it was. It's since come to light that these men weren't responsible at all. They were given up as sacrifices by their families in order to end the violence and find a way out to peace. So we had that kind of thing happening in the Chilcotin War in British Columbia as well, a couple generations later. These are the tribes that took place or took part in the treaty, the Yakima, Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla peoples. There are a few images from the treaty. This is the arrival, the long-awaited arrival of the Nez Perce delegation. It kind of cut into the timeline of the treaty because they were slow to arrive as they were assembling and conferring at a distance. And the council was held under conditions like this, as a different view. Presumably they were trying to keep the sun off. This is Pio Pio Mox Mox again. He was there, Chief Kamiakin of the Yakima, chief lawyer from the Nez Perce, and young chief, who we're going to be looking at closely, from a man from both Nez Perce and Cayuse families, old Chief Joseph, and Kamiakin again, and young Chief Joseph, Joseph's son, famous for being the surviving war leader of the flight of the Nez Perce, otherwise called the Nez Perce War, which was a few years later. On the American side, 2 of the prominent men, Governor Isaac Stevens and Joel Palmer, who was acting as Oregon Indian agent. And he also later brought the first herd of cattle to British Columbia during the Caribou Gold Rush, completely against U.S. Army rules. He did it anyway, and he opened up that route for bringing cattle north. As a result of the war, Cayuse land was immediately opened up for settlement, and many of the Cayuse were disenfranchised, as were many of the French Canadians. This is the Timmins farm. It is basically at the center of it all, really close to the Whitman Mission, really close to Pio Pio Mox Mox's winter village, and really close to Frenchtown itself. Because of the treaty, allowing people to continue to hunt and fish in their traditional areas, there are many places, such as here at the foot of the Bonneville Dam, where native peoples are fishing for salmon in an attempt to catch the fish that the technologies such as the dam have made very scarce. And here they are doing the same at the Dalles, and again facing off against the Dalles Dam. This treaty, in other words, has a very strong contemporary meaning, and it's been estimated by some sources that more money has been spent trying to fulfill those treaty obligations than has been raised by generating power in the not in the main stem dams on the Columbia River. So a great economic consequence to a small clause in the treaty. How we got to the treaty, the man on the left, Andrew J. Bolon, was murdered in Yakima Territory in the hills above Goldendale, Washington. He was investigating the murder of two gold miners who were setting off across Yakima Territory to get to Idaho, where they were going to go gold mining. And along the way, they raped a native girl, and her brother and cousins murdered them, taking justice into their own hands. While Bolon was going back to the Dalles to report on his findings, he took in with a few other with three native people who were traveling, and one of them took it upon himself to murder Bolon. And this led to the 1855 war, which took place here. This is the contemporary Washington city of Yakima. You can see the arms of the hills coming in the back of the picture, and the point between them is the battlefield, and that's called Union Gap. In behind is Toppenish on the Yakima reservation lands, and an important mission is off to the right up Autonum Creek, and that was Chief Kamiakin's winter camp. And this man, Father Charles Pandozzi, had his camp there. Because he tried to prevent the war, he became the main target of this man, Gabriel Rains, who was the head of the Washington Volunteers at this point. And the battle at Union Gap forced the need to settle that 1855 treaty quickly. Just incidentally, Rains went on to be a prominent Confederate officer in the U.S. Civil War, and has the distinction of having invented the landmine. So that's Rains. And this is Young Chief, who we're going to be talking about real soon. But I thought before we get into looking at what Young Chief had to say, a lot of what he had to say was he was talking about the land. He called it the ground, or it was translated as the ground. We would call it Ilahi. But he was insisting that the land, the earth, had a voice, and we needed to pay attention to that when answering the questions and in bargaining for the treaty. So what land are we talking about? Well, a bit of Nez Perce land, the heart of the monster, the origin story of the Nez Perce, and the Asotan village here, looking over the Columbia, which is down below to Clarkston, Washington, Buffalo Eddy, above the Kuskookee River, outside of Lewiston, up the Snake River, and back to Buffalo Eddy. Just a few photos to show the kind of places that might have had a voice. And in Yakima country, along the Columbia, up at the head of the Yakima Valley, on the Yakima Reservation lands. Here as well. And yeah, here in the near Ellensburg at the mouth of Manastash Creek, where Charles Pandozzi had another mission. Here in the Yakima River Canyon, even down at Horse Thief Butte on the Columbia, and up over the pass towards the Klickitat, even as far as Ojai's fish camp on the Wenatchee River, at Mool Spring, at Kamiakin's camp, back to Horse Thief Butte. And this is actually Chief Slow-Ohm's camp, very close to where Bolin was murdered. And a little bit of Walla Walla and Cayuse country. This is Frenchtown again, of course. And the people, the Lixiu, are called the Cayuse, as after a French term for the rock people. One can perhaps see why they're called the rock people. They lived in this rocky landscape, in part, such as the two Cayuse sisters we met before, but also this green land along the rivers, and as far as Chief Moses' winter camps in Moses Coulee, but far to the north. And Umatilla country is varied as well, but always on the same kind of theme of forests and grasslands and shrub steppe, and even as far as the John Day Painted Hills. So I'd like to look, in a sec here on the remarks of Lawyer briefly, and then at more length, Young Chief. But first, let's look at what Joel Palmer had to say in answer to Young Chief. He said, "We don't come to steal your lands. We pay you more than it is worth. Here in this little valley and the Umatilla Valley that affords a little good land, between these two streams, and all around it is a parched up plain. What is it worth to you or to us? Not one half of what we have offered for it. Why do we offer you so much? It's because our chief has told us to take care of his red people." Now, this is a man who has played his cards as a very committed defender of native rights. He was a Quaker, and he did try very hard to find a fair and humane settlements for the violence, especially in the Rogue River area. However, he was also working for the U.S. administration and was representing a non-native point of view. But if we look at his worthless, parched up plain and just put it into perspective, in the treaty process, almost all of Oregon, a big state, was purchased for 4 cents an acre through the treaty process, or $1,500,000. And in comparison, Louisiana, with its 500 million acres, purchased a generation before for 3 to 4 cents an acre, and Alaska a few years later for 2 cents an acre. Out of just to look at how worthless that land is, and the fact that as soon as the first war was finished, like the Cayuse Valley was already being plowed up as farmland. This is the kind of wealth that parched land is able to produce. In 2025, 52 million bushels of wheat in Oregon, 141 million in Washington, and 106 million in Idaho, not to mention other crops. So the land wasn't entirely useless. This is wheat fields at above Pasco. And here we are in the Horse Heaven Hills. And again, in the Horse Heaven Hills, up above the Yakima Valley. Farmers are getting licenses today to put up wind machines on the principle that as owners of the land, they deserve to get a profit on their investment. Here's some wheat fields near Walla Walla, near the mouth of the Walla Walla River, with both kind of activities taking place. Or actually, that's an alfalfa field. Here's wheat fields on the Camash Prairie, up above Lewiston. And here we are in the Columbia Basin itself, the old High Country School, single room school, now big industrial farms, no need for a school for children that aren't there. Big wheat country. So not exactly a parched and worthless land, but here we are again with lawyer and young chief. So before we go further, any comments, thoughts?
Sad. Very sad.
Powerful stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that it's not just the U.S. history; it's Canadian history as well.
Yes,
Cascadia.
like a very good friend of mine from Williams Lake, BC. His family was one of those families who fled Frenchtown during the 1855 war, and they've been solidly in British Columbia ever since. Yeah, and they're not the only ones. Yeah. So, yeah.
So how much research? Looks like you've researched this quite a bit. Are you going on books that have been written about this? You're doing your own research? How does that work?
Oh, yeah, like there's a lot of books written about this because the Whitman mission and this war were really primary in American historical material about the West and the claim for Oregon. So there's a lot of material, but it's a lot of it, especially the older material from the 19th century, is really biased. And so I just kept going down that rabbit hole, trying to find more balanced stories, and then wound up traveling through the country a lot, trying to figure out what it was looking like. But there's a lot of material on this, and once you've read 10 or 20 books, you start cutting through the mythology a bit and seeing what's going on. Yeah. It
So
is
how long have you been doing this project?
since 2009.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
A lot of the photographs, especially the ones that you first showed of the militia going after the Cayuse in the first settlement in Frenchtown,
Yeah.
they were scarily reminiscent to me of the scenes that you see of ICE going after people in American cities, and the same kind of mentality of saying we need to remove people. That
Yes.
it was really I think, yeah, anyways, it's just one of those things that a lot of the rhetoric out there is that this kind of attitude about removing people just started in the last 10 years, and seeing it go back as far as you're pointing it to go back to is kind of even more terrifying.
You noticed that I did not mention that, but I was sitting here hoping someone would put the pieces together and go, oh, this is a contemporary story. So thank you for being the person who did that. Yeah, and the other thing, the kind of tactics of setting up a situation that then can be responded to with violence. We're seeing that kind of behavior going on today as well, but not just in the United States. However, yeah, very contemporary stuff like this. I had, as I was thinking about what we were going to talk about during these workshops, the secondary idea came up to me that one interesting response to the contemporary social and political troubles would be to um, have this historical Cascadian perspective presented in response to what's going on. There's lots of people responding and giving historical background, but one could set up a series of responses based in Cascadian experience and history and provide this secondary angle to things. Yeah, which maybe is partly what we're doing, putting things into a perspective rooted in where we are, because everything is rooted here. It's where we're standing, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for that. Um, and we open with Governor Stevens saying he wants to speak heart to heart with the tribes gathered there, and he wants everyone to speak with one heart and to really speak from the heart. And he's given a very short timeline for settling a treaty. One of the first people, maybe the first to speak, is Lawyer. So Lawyer was a Christianized Nez Perce man, not from the Whitman's mission, but from a parallel mission on the Clearwater River, the Spalding mission, and he continually and with great faith attempted a peaceful path out of the struggles and to always work with the Americans instead of against them. And he earned the nickname Lawyer because he was always speaking eloquently about law, American law, and Christian principles. And so he was much loved. There were a few others, much loved by American settlers and politicians for taking this point of view. And what he says in one little thing that he says before Young Chief speaks, from the time of Columbus and from the time of Lewis and Clark, we have known our friends. We poor people have known you as brothers. Although we were a poor people, a people knowing nothing when we first saw the white chiefs, Lewis and Clark. So that's 1805. From those poor people, there were some of them that started in that direction, and he points to the east. And of these, there is only one now living, Spokane Gary, who was there, who had gone to the Red River in the east to be taught Christian principles. And they want to be taught. They returned after they could see a little and told us about the Great Spirit, so the Christian God. They told us the laws for the poor people, so the indigenous people. He's playing the humans are poor, weak creatures that need stronger spirits to care for them on this earth, indigenous supplication process. They had seen and heard them, the laws, My chief said, our old laws are poor. The new laws we are getting are good laws, are straight. We said, there were these laws, the laws of the commandments, our old laws, the laws of our forefathers, and the new laws we are getting shown to us. There were laws, and those laws should be sent to us. So he's counseling, accepting that there are better laws now. They come from God. There are these commandments. They make sense. They create an ordered, civilized society, and that all the tribes need to be accepting this. And part of his argument is we don't want to fight, like, because that's not going to lead us anywhere good. We need to work together with the new laws coming from the new powerful authorities and accept them and work with them. A kind of argument that we see today as well. So um, let's look at what Young Chief says in answer to this, because he has a far different point of view. Um, um, so, yeah, so he says, maybe I'll share the screen so you can see what I'm looking at here. Where is it? Here we go. And is that big enough? Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So he says here, us Indians are blind. Remember, this is in translation, and translation is a weird, spooky thing. Like, words don't necessarily translate exactly to other words, so some interpretation has to be done. So this is coming from Sahaptin and being translated by two men, one of whom is French, from Frenchtown, who knows Sahaptin, and the other who's U.S. English-speaking American from near Spalding's Mission, who speaks Nez Perce. And so we have the two main translators, one of whom English is his first language and one of whom French is his first language, translating into an English for English-speaking Americans. There's bound to be some stuff lost in the translation. So he's saying, we do not see the earth well. The lawyer sees clear. The reason that I do not know anything about this ground is I do not see the offer you have made us yet. If I had the money in my hand, then I would see. The country is very large, is the reason this land is afraid. So you'll see that I've taken some Wawa words that applied to this in order to then have some English words, as we spoke about last time, to apply with it, and to try to rephrase this a little bit as kind of an attempt at retranslation that might include some of the knowledge that Wawa suggests is in indigenous ways of thinking. So we people of the land are blind because we don't have a clear view of how the earth will respond. Lawyer can see clearly. The reason I don't know the ground being suggested is that I do not see the offer you have made us yet. If I had the money that is being offered in my hand, then I could weigh it and see right away. The territory, and that's in one hand, is very large and is the reason that this land is afraid, because the heavier one on a scale, a balance scale, is going to pull down, and the other one's going to be dangling up in the air with a long way to fall. So to him, territory and settled land are two different things. And the land has a will of its own. And basically, he's representing the kind of bargaining, the hui hui bargaining, the way bargaining that took place at Fort Nez Perce, where you put 5 beaver skins down, and the trader then puts down a bag of shot and a bag of flour and something else, and then you don't agree, so something is added until you have a balance, and then you say, wait, hoi hoi, and you have an agreement. So he's expecting to have an agreement based on those old trading foundations. However, the U.S. officials are looking at from their own cultural point of view, that this is a land sale transaction, just the same as with a settler coming to the land and being given a land grant and having obligations, and so they're talking past each other. So then Young Chief says, I wonder if this ground has anything to say, right? Um, and we can, by looking at the Wawa and the English, get to the point of rephrasing. I'm looking to see if this ancestral site, Ilahi, will speak. So he's looking into the earth and his connections to it. He wants the land, the earth, to give an answer. And the Americans, who are looking into their traditions of God, authority, and a practical scientific self grounded in an earth of humanly owned and manipulated things, that kind of English you were asking about, with why does it have concepts of being, why is it structured like it is, quite different from Young Chief's looking for the land to speak. And what they hear is, instead of him wanting to see whether the land can respond, he thinks that he's actually expecting the ground to talk, and they're hearing the man is living in a fairy tale, which is not a way to move forward in a negotiation. So Young Chief continues, I wonder if the ground is listening to what is said. And maybe the meaning, once we look at some of the Wawa, with its distinction between Wawa, which is talk, and Quolan, which is ear and hearing together as the same thing, and Rhenisch, which is looking and seeing together as the same process, no separation, right? And econom, which is business talk, non-sacred talk, right? Discussions on business matters or modern matters, but not about land and stuff. And then Hiem, which is sacred talk, ancestral stories, including land and ancestors, the kind of stories that would give your family rights to an Ilahi, rights to a fishing spot. He's got distinctions between all of these things. So perhaps when he says, I wonder if the ground is listening to what is said, he's really saying something maybe closer. I'm looking to see if my ancestral situation is hearing this, right? And he's wondering whether we're talking in the right way, whether the ancestral land and water relationships with humans can pay attention to the kind of talk we're having here. The U.S. officials, on the other hand, are listening for signs that he understands the bond between self and duty and law. Lawyer does, but he doesn't. So again, they think they're hearing a man talking about a fairy tale, when he's really talking about law as well as he conceives of it. So then he goes on to say, I wonder if the ground would come to life. Um, we're using the same vocabulary here, but we're adding to it the idea of grass coming out of the soil in the spring, of food plants coming out of the soil in the spring in response to the Creator's call for other beings than humans to support these weak humans and give them sustenance out of their own selves. And that'll be the land coming to life with grass in the spring. And the Americans, however, being modern peoples, see the earth, and because this is the mid 19th century, women as well as passive and accepting bodies to be seated by male effort. If the men are vigorous and manly, growth will occur in answer. It'll bear fruit. And this concept is linked to manifest destiny. At the time of the first Cayuse War, when there were 5 men who were called white men in the state of Washington, including several recently arrived Catholic priests, one of whom was Father Pandozzi, who we saw in the 1855 war there. Pandozzi walked 125 miles from his place on Manastash Creek near Ellensburg. He walked all the way to Fort Nez Perce barefoot to prove to the people that he really did love them, because he could walk in their shoes, and it was kind of his walk with Christ up the hill to the crucifixion. And he was mocked. He was mocked for going barefoot in a culture in which the beauty of a man's boots was an important part of your male identity. So these kind of concepts of virility and passivity were very much in the air. And unfortunately, when Young Chief is talking about ancestral relationships and spirit communication in like Slahal, which we looked at, what the U.S. representatives are going to hear coming from a Christian background, and is him saying he's wondering if the earth will be alive, right? And this could only be seen as blasphemy, because only God can make the earth live, and only God is the life within the earth. So there's a misfit in the power dynamic here. He's speaking as something other than a modern individual and being heard by modern individuals who have a hard time hearing what he's saying. So, and then he's talking about what is on the earth, right? And then he's saying, but I hear what this earth says. So he's making a change in his argument. He's now talking that I do hear what the earth says, right? And the main Wawa word that might be useful here is Keshi, which is notwithstanding that, or on the other side, always turning things over to look at the other side. So we're weak. We don't really. I'm waiting to hear what the earth says, but I'm hearing it, and he's building up his authority to speak further, and then he says, the earth says, God has placed me here. I'm pretty sure that by God, he probably was meaning Sagali Tayi, the creator, who is formative in indigenous plateau cultures, just as the Christian God is in American cultures. But there's a really interesting sense here. God has placed me here. The verbs that are at play in Wawa are verbs of being at rest, like settling down, having a seat, relaxing, not being working and scurrying and moving, but being here safe in this place, relaxed. We're here, right? Much something, not too much different than the English or U.S. English concept of having a settler and settling down and having your own spread and being safe in your own home. But the idea of rest is really dominant here, and I would suggest he's saying here in the earth shows that the creator has made me one with this spot. He's placed me here. He's settled me here. I don't have to move anymore because I'm settled in terms of how these verbs work. However, it's a dominant US myth that settlement on land and turning a stretch of earth into a home and a farm, which is embedded in social hierarchies of competition and commerce, makes a person moral and a responsible citizen. This is an old thing. It goes back to the founding fathers of the United States. It's a really primary thing, the idea that on one hand, every American can have their own home on the earth, and on the other hand, such as in the Columbia Basin in the center of Washington, where millions of acres of land were set aside. Grand Coulee Dam was put across to Columbia to store water in order to irrigate these millions of acres of land, in order that 50,000 black sharecroppers who were causing political unrest in the U.S. South, or maybe were just unwanted by certain white cultures in the U.S. South, could be transferred here to this land, and land would teach them, instead of being culturally obstructive, however, whatever that might mean, would teach them stewardship and husbandry, and to be good citizens instead of poor sharecroppers. That plan never came to fruition because of the Second World War, and after the war, all that land was given instead to white industrial farmers, who, interestingly enough, certainly hardworking people. There's no question, and successful businessmen. But I saw something 10 years ago where one of them was claiming that the great success of agriculture in the Columbia Plateau was solely through the hard work of these industrial farmers, and no mention was made of the $2 billion US subsidy of Grand Coulee Dam to provide the water to make it all happen. So again, there's differences of understanding here, and I think Young Chief is saying to the Americans, your power is not greater than the Creator's. He placed me here, and you can't defy the Creator and move me. Only the Creator can do that. And the Americans are hearing that the U.S. represents God, and the U.S. is placing you on a reservation, and if you are obedient, you should be following God's law. So again, they're talking past each other, although the language is not that different. And then Young Chief says the earth says that that God tells me to take care of the Indians on this earth, and the operative Wawa words that might apply are tiki, um, and which is love, want, desire, wish, long for. So not just, I love you and I'm going to take care of you because you're a family member, but there's this whole bundle of feelings that of reciprocal relationships that are involved. It's not just a one-off caring for situation. The earth says to the Indians that stop on the earth, feed them right. So he's now expanding on his statement of settling, being placed by the Creator, this sense of being at rest and not having to go anywhere else, and making this into more of an abstract statement that Indians that stop on the earth, perhaps that's from the new reservation ideas, need to be fed in the ways appropriate to such a relationship with the earth. And if we look at what Wawa can contribute, we have the word potlatch, for instance, which is to give a gift, and usually were used attached to a traditional ceremonial feast in which wealth is status, and status comes from giving, and then it will be returned in the future in this mutually respectful relationship, and from the verb cloche, which means lush elementally. It's not just good in the terms of moral, but it's good in the terms of being absolutely abundant with life and doing well in that sense, right? And we have this in English. We have terms like flush with life, the good life. He has a healthy appetite. She has the goods, right? The wealth of a community. So we have it in English to express these ideas. What is different is that the Americans hearing this through no fault of their own, at least in this sense, are not using English in that way. But we have the ability to translate somewhat differently using these other capacities of the language. And I think what he's saying is the earth gives food for people. If people don't have access to the food where it is, and let's say you put them on a reservation, there's an obligation to provide them with food wherever they are. Otherwise, the circle of respect is broken. And I think the American, to be perfectly fair and respectful, the U.S. context at the time was more on the lines of every man must look after himself and his family. And the U.S. agents were hoping to teach Native people to do so. And then, having done that, leave them to their independence and considering this independence as respect. On the other hand, Young Chief would not be hearing that as respect at all. And to be fair again, the American negotiators were probably hearing him asking for a handout, a sign of weakness, like Pandozzi wandering around barefoot. And on we go. So Young Chief is saying God named the roots that he should feed Indians on. The water speaks the same way. So now he's drawing the water into this discussion. God says, feed the Indians upon the earth. The grass says the same thing. He's building up this lovely rhetorical speech feed the horses and cattle. So not only do the people need this relationship with the earth to be maintained, so do the horses and cattle. And an interesting one, the earth and water and grass say, God has given our names, and we are told those names. So if we look at name in Wawa, it's name. If we look at the word mamuk, that's the verb for embodying the spirit of a thing to realize it, to make it real. And mamuk kumtaks, to teach and explain, and kumtaks being to know. So there is this sense that a name isn't just a word attached to a human, but it is the embodiment of the spirit of a person. So, a young Chief Joseph, who we saw earlier, who will, history sees again in the Nez Perce War. He's called in English Joseph, given a Christian name, and his Nez Perce name means thunder rising over the mountains. So his name was given to him to illustrate, to embody his interpersonal spirit, and to give a name to that spirit. And perhaps the sense of that young chief is giving is that ancestral sites, water and grass, are all proof that the Creator has explained who we are. Who we are is that name, it's that embodiment. And we've been taught those names and have learned them through that instruction of the Creator giving them to us. We are embodied as this place. And the American context would be more leaning towards that names are social and given by people, and they aren't given by God, and you can change them. Like we can call a thunder rising over the mountains Joseph, and that's his name now. They're not really understanding what Young Chief is saying about ancestral earth. And Young Chief says neither the Indians or the whites have a right to change those names. The earth says, God has placed me here to produce all that grows upon me, the trees, fruit, etc. The same way the earth says, it was from her man was made. So he's continually rephrasing his thought. And God, on placing them on the earth, instructed them to take good care of the earth and to do each other no harm. So he's trying to respect that, or stress that respectful relationship now. So he's building towards a conclusion, which is coming soon. And God said, you Indians who take care of a certain portion of the country should not trade it off unless you get a fair price. So here's a point at which Wawa, coming from the culture of this region at that time, can give us a little insight into what he's saying. We have makuk, which is to buy or sell, trade and bargain, and it's the same thing because trade is bargain. We have tennis, which is a small thing. It could be a child, or it could be some incomplete part of a whole. So, for instance, a sitcom is half of the thing, and tennis sitcom is $0.25. It's a small part. And if we remember that Spanish coins were in circulation until around 1870, they were even here in British Columbia, and you paid for things by breaking them into bits. So a $0.50 is 4 bits, a quarter is 2 bits. When I was a kid, we never said quarter, we always said 2 bits, and it comes from this same concept that in applying this, if you break off a piece of the Earth's relationship to humans and saying you must live on that small piece now, you have to make sure that that larger relationship of the Earth caring for people is continued. The relationship is not broken by giving the people a smaller portion. Um, um, However, the American context would be quite different, which was that the whole reason for justifying settlement was that the native people were considered not to own the land because they roamed across it in seasonal rounds of harvest and hunting. They didn't settle permanently in a place and build it up as a farm. And the American concept being that when you had incorporated your labor into the land, you couldn't be separated from it, because removing a man from ownership of his labor in the context of a country battling with slavery was slavery. And here we have a little bit of a problem. So, young chief is saying, I am, as it were, blind. I am blind and ignorant. I have a heart, but cannot say much. That is the reason the chiefs do not understand each other right. So he's trying to make a big picture to integrate lawyers' Christian thinking with the objections of the other chiefs and to try to find diplomatic common ground by patiently teaching indigenous ways of looking at the land in order that the eyes of the Americans can be opened and they can recognize the importance of these obligations of respect linked to the land. Although I see your offer before me, I do not understand it. Lawyer understood your offer and he took it. I walk, as it were, in the dark and cannot take hold of what I do not see. I do not understand it and I do not yet take it. So he's not going to understand whether a small piece of land broken off of the whole can support his people until he sees whether there's enough food growing from that land to support his people, support the water, the fish, the horses, the cattle. Until he sees that happen, he can't speak for the creator or the earth and say, yes, that'll be enough. He has no answer. The earth must speak the answer with things. And what the US probably heard was him saying, I don't understand what you guys are saying, so I won't choose yet. But when I do understand, I'll say yes. I don't know when, but that's what I'm saying. And so I would suggest that the US negotiators are taking this up as invitation to keep pressing in the same way they are pressing. And then I thought I would give you a little response that comes from Joel Palmer. And here we are. Yeah, I'll just share this with you so you can see. Here we go. So make this a little bigger, maybe. So in direct response to what Young Chief has just been trying to explain, Palmer says, we have listened and heard your chief speak. The heart of the Nez Perce and ours are one. The Cayuses, the Walla Wallas, and these other people say they do not understand us. So he's saying, okay, we've got lawyer, but you guys, you don't understand. You're saying you don't understand us. But let me tell you, we were in hopes we would have but one heart. as Stevens opened the discussion, why should we have more than one heart? The young chief says he does not see what we propose to give them. Pio Pio Mox Mox, the grand chief of the Cayuse, says the same. Can we bring these sawmills and these grist mills here on our backs to show these people? So he's being really literal. The treaty promises sawmills and grist mills, and he's saying, you're asking us to bring them here to the Treaty Council so you can see them before you sign? And Palmer says, can we bring these blacksmith shops, the wagons and tools on our backs to show them at this time? Can we cause farms of wheat and of corn to spring up in a day that they may see it? Can we build these schoolhouses and these dwellings in a day? Can we bring all the money that these things will cost that you may see it? It would be more than all the horses of any one of these men could carry. It takes time to do these things. We come first now to see you and make a bargain. We brought but a few goods with us to give you, but whatever we agreed to give you, you will get. How long will these people remain blind? We came to try to open their eyes. They refused the light. I have a wife and children. My brother has a wife and children. I have a good home, fields of wheat, potatoes, oats, peas, and beans. Why should I leave them and come so far to see you? It was to try and do you good, but you throw it away. Why do you do that? We all sometimes do wrong, sometimes because our hearts are bad, and sometimes because we have bad counsel. And then he goes on to his statement of here in this little valley that affords a little good land between these two streams, and all around it is a parched up plain. He's not understanding, but he knows enough of indigenous culture from what is by now 8 years in the country to get the gist of it, that young chief wants to see the stuff before he gives an answer. But what he missed was young chief wants to see whether there's enough productivity coming from the land to support the people, or whether they will be compensated for any lack. And it's not for him to speak for the earth and the ancestors to determine that on the little evidence he's been given. So all of that shows how far apart the two positions were. It also shows how, there was ground for coming together more meaningfully if the will was there to do it. And it also shows that if, yes, I don't speak Sahaptin, and neither did Palmer. However, if we apply our poetic intelligence and the understandings within Wawa, and our understandings about how a less abstract English of people on the land and water works, that we can get a little farther into young chief's point of view and interpret what was said at the meeting differently than it was at the time, because interpretations and translations are all cultural. They're cultural messages. And because time has passed, and we have different culture now, we can understand what was said from both sides. We have some tools using Wawa, which comes from the people and the land differently than other original languages, but it contains some of the spiritual and cultural relationships, so we can approach this original text more meaningfully than perhaps we could have in the past or without these tools. And I think by adding the old English land-based kind of relationships to earth and water, that we can have those tools at our hand as well, either to translate these kind of documents into something that includes Cascadia and our land and water and these 20,000 years of human relationships that arose here, or to create our own works based upon the insight into how it's possible to relate to this land free of the cultural guidance that the language has given us, such as the earlier comment of why is English leading us in certain directions. But I think with this approach, English can lead us in many different directions and incorporate more material, including the voice of the land or the earth, whatever that might be, however we conceive it, at least in different ways than the ones from the immediate colonial or imperial moment of settlement, and we can move forward with much broader horizons that include more people. So that's my hope of what this approach can give you if you work it through. If you want to study the material later, you can see how I played with it and worked these ideas through, and you can even apply the techniques to other speeches in the minutes that were recorded. There are a lot of people talking there. Applying them to one of the American negotiators would be really interesting to see whether what they're saying could be opened up in a way that Wawa would represent, that kind of is the same mishearing on the indigenous side that contributed to how these treaties led to such poor outcomes. Anyway, that's my shtick for the day. Any questions, thoughts? We have a couple of minutes left. Oh, not really, but maybe we do.
Well, just real quick, just to clarify, the language spoken during those negotiations was not Wawa, was not Chinook, but we can use Wawa and Chinook to gain insight into what the indigenous were actually saying.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Given that there's a common source there,
Yeah,
there's cultural information that's shared, and it at least we have a doorway we can go through, and
right.
it gives us a bit of a view, right?
Yeah.
Any other comments?
Is that language that was spoken at the time, is it still exist?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Was the original indigenous words, were those recorded or just the translation, the English translation?
No, just the translation.
Yeah,
That's the
okay.
difficulty. But
Realize the rub.
you can get the dictionaries for all these languages. People have been working really hard and made some really beautiful dictionaries.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Unfortunately, the Sahaptin one is only Sahaptin to English. If you want the English to Sahaptin side of it, you have to actually put up some money. Google won't
Yeah.
help you. You have to go to the University of Washington Press and say, yes, here's my money. And then they'll send you a copy of the whole thing. Sneaky. Yeah. So, anyway, was that of any use?
That was extraordinary. I,
Oh,
I'm kind of reeling at yeah, that was extraordinary. What a close look at things, Harold, that you've undertaken here. I just want to thank you for that. It's a lot to it's a lot to absorb. Um, but I certainly am appreciating almost I almost get this image if I take it to the human body that there are these tiny little veins that are running through as well that in a way we don't see or know about or pay attention to, and this is just like opening that and showing us, whoa, there's that and that way of looking at things, and it's
So yeah,
a good way to learn history.
I think you'll find that if you just dive in and play with a few sentences and dig into the wah and see what's there, um, that it'll sort of open up in a way that is meaningful to you, and you can continue the process and just kind of like get that kind of intuitive sense as to what is going on by following those linguistic threads. At least I'm hoping that that's a tool that will open up when you practice it.
Thank you.
I do find using language in these different ways and one thing on top of another on top of another, it is a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose. And I do appreciate the recordings so I can sit down and then okay, stop, pause, think about, okay.
Yeah.
Because it takes a little bit of time to assimilate and digest. And then there's, of course, all these different rabbit holes. You can pause it and, okay, really? Look at that. And
Rabbit holes are good. Yes. All right. So that's this for today. And then next time we're going to do something kind of similar using the language of poetry. And we're going to work with the idea of a Cascadian poetry that uses both British and American foundations to create something we can say, yes, this is in the spirit of Cascadia, of Old Oregon and the Columbia District as they were first formed when we were all here together negotiating our future culture and saying, yeah, we haven't lost that coming together. We can still do that, as opposed to always writing poetry that refers to U.S. traditions and a U.S. in a large sense audience, or to Canadian traditions or British traditions and those audiences. We can say we're at the center of the world. We're the people who've come together here, and we can blend them as we have been doing for 150 years. And look what we can do. So that's what we're going to play with next time.
Sounds great.
That sounds good.
Okay. Thanks
good night,
for
everyone.
Sure.
Thanks, Harold.
Thanks, Harold. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Everyone.
Thanks,
Yeah, next
Paul,
week.
for making this happen.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.